In the shadows of a London alleyway, a single gasp can cost a woman her life. For Genevieve Archer, a widow who has built a sanctuary for the forgotten, the price of truth is a marriage to a man who breathes war. It is a dance of shadows, where the line between protector and prisoner blurs, and the only thing more dangerous than a killer's blade is the steady, rhythmic beat of a soldier's heart. If you find yourself lost in this tale of fire and truth, subscribe for the next chapter. Tell us in the comments, would you choose the safety of a lie or the peril of the truth? Chapter 1. The Arrangement. The fog in Spitalfields did not merely roll, it clung. It tasted of coal dust and the copper tang of the nearby tanneries, a thick, cloying shroud that turned the gaslights into sickly yellow bruises in the dark. Genevieve Archer pulled her wool shawl tighter, the dampness seeping through her gloves as she hurried toward the St. Jude's Home for Foundlings. She was late, an unforgivable sin when 20 hungry children awaited their evening porridge. She took the shortcut through Miller's Court, a narrow vein of an alleyway where the silence felt unnervingly heavy. It was the silence that saved her. A sharp metallic clink, the sound of a carriage door latch, echoed against the brick. Genevieve froze, pressing herself into the recess of a soot-stained doorway. 10 paces away, a man lay slumped against a crate, his throat a jagged ruin of crimson. Standing over him, fastidiously wiping a silver-headed cane with a silk handkerchief, was a man whose face Genevieve knew from the front pages of the Gazette. Viscount Sterling, a pillar of the House of Lords, a man who now looked at the corpse with the same detached boredom one might afford a ruined pair of boots. Genevieve's breath hitched, a tiny, treacherous sound. Sterling's head snapped toward her. In the flicker of a dying lamp, his eyes met hers, cold, aristocratic, and utterly devoid of mercy. She didn't scream. She ran. 2 days later, the sanctuary of her small parlor felt like a cage. The scent of beeswax and old books, usually so comforting, was overshadowed by the looming presence of the man sitting by her cold hearth. "You cannot be serious," Genevieve said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. She stood behind her mahogany desk, her fingers digging into the wood. "I am a widow of modest means. I run a school. I do not require a husband." "You require a shield, Mrs. Archer," the man replied. Captain Marcus Reed did not look like a savior. He looked like a man who had been broken and put back together with iron and spite. He sat with his left leg stretched out stiffly, the result of a French musket ball at Victoria, and his coat, though brushed clean, was the somber charcoal of a man who lived in the peripheries of society. His face was a map of hard lines, his eyes the color of a winter sea. "The Home Office is quite clear," Marcus continued, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Sterling has already sent men to your school under the guise of charitable inquiry. He knows who you are. He is waiting for the right moment to ensure your silence is permanent. I am the deterrent. By moving into my home, by claiming a name that isn't yours." Genevieve stepped around the desk, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards. "The impropriety alone." "Is irrelevant if you are dead," Marcus interrupted, rising slowly. The rhythmic thud-scrape of his cane against the rug emphasized his physical presence. He was a large man, and in the small room he seemed to swallow the light. "I am to be Mr. Marcus Archer, your late husband's cousin, recently returned from the Indies. We have decided to reconcile for the sake of the children. It is a tawdry story, but one society will find too dull to investigate." Genevieve felt a flare of indignation. She had spent 3 years carving out a life of independence after the stifling, colorless marriage of her youth. "You intend to turn my home into a garrison?" "I intend to keep you alive, madame," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to the pulse fluttering at her throat, "whether you care for my methods or not." The next week was a blur of calculated intrusion. Marcus moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. He replaced the locks on the heavy oak doors with reinforced iron bolts. He spent hours by the windows, his silhouette a dark sentinel against the glass. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, heavy weight. The children, her brood of 20 orphans, were not easily fooled. They watched him with the wide, suspicious eyes of those who had learned early that men with scars usually brought trouble. "Is he a pirate?" whispered Pip, a spindly 7-year-old, during dinner. "He is a relative, Pip. Eat your bread," Genevieve murmured, though she felt Marcus's gaze on her from the head of the long table. He ate like a soldier, quickly, efficiently, his eyes never leaving the door. He had discarded his coat in the heat of the kitchen, and the linen of his shirt clung to the broad expanse of his shoulders. Genevieve found herself staring at the way his muscles moved, a sudden sharp heat blooming in her chest that she chose to attribute to anger. The tension broke when a small, grubby hand reached over Marcus's shoulder. It was Jack, the eldest of the street-savvy boys she employed as lookouts. He didn't speak. He simply dropped a crumpled scrap of paper next to Marcus's plate and vanished back into the shadows of the hallway. Marcus smoothed the paper with a calloused thumb. His expression didn't change, but Genevieve saw his jaw tighten. "What is it?" she asked, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. Marcus looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with a frightening intensity. He didn't hand her the note. He didn't have to. "The fancy cove's been asking questions at the market," Marcus quoted softly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "He's looking for a widow with a school, and he's offering £100 for the address." Genevieve felt the blood drain from her face. The walls of her sanctuary suddenly felt very thin. "They're coming, aren't they?" Marcus stood, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He didn't offer her platitudes or comfort. He simply checked the pistol tucked into his waistband and looked at her with the cold, steady gaze of a man who had walked through fire and expected to do so again. "Let them come," he said. "I've been waiting for a reason to settle a score." The following weeks transformed the St. Jude's Home for Foundlings from a place of quiet, orderly poverty into a site of tactical preparation. The transition was not seamless. Captain Marcus Reed moved through the narrow hallways like a ghost of the peninsula, his presence a constant reminder that the world outside was no longer a place of commerce and carriage rides, but a battlefield. Chapter 2: Fortress and Family. The storm broke over London on a Tuesday, a violent, thrashing thing that rattled the window panes and turned the Thames into a churning grey soup. Inside the school, Genevieve was attempting to settle the younger children for their nap when a sudden, thunderous crack echoed through the house. A rogue shutter had broken its latch and slammed against the brickwork. The sound hadn't even faded before she heard it, the heavy, frantic thud of footsteps and the clatter of a chair being overturned in the parlor. Genevieve hurried down the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found Marcus in the corner of the room, his back pressed against the bookshelves, his breathing ragged and shallow. His eyes were wide, fixed on the door, but they weren't seeing the floral wallpaper or the flickering hearth. He looked through the walls, through time itself, to a place where such cracks meant the arrival of French artillery. "Captain," she said, softly, keeping her distance. She didn't reach for him. She knew better than to startle a cornered wolf. He didn't answer. His hand was white-knuckled around the head of his cane, his knuckles standing out like bleached bone. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Marcus," She tried again, her voice a low melodic hum, the same tone she used to soothe a child waking from a nightmare. "You are in Spitalfields. You are at St. Jude's. The children are safe. It was only the wind." She began to recite the inventory of the room, a trick she had learned from a surgeon's wife years ago. "There is the clock. It is 5 minutes past 2. There is the scent of lavender on the linens. There is the tea, cooling on the tray." Slowly, the frantic light in his eyes dimmed. He blinked, the focus returning to his sharp features. He looked down at his trembling hands, a flash of raw, naked shame crossing his countenance before he masked it behind his usual stony indifference. "I apologize, Mrs. Archer," he rasped, his voice sounding as though it had been dragged over gravel. "A soldier's mind is often a traitorous thing." "There is no need for apologies for a wound we cannot see," Genevieve said firmly. She stepped closer, and for the first time she allowed herself to touch him, a brief, grounding pressure of her hand on his forearm. Through the sleeve of his coat, his muscles felt like coiled wire, humming with a tension that broke her heart. "You protect us. Allow us, in some small way, to offer you peace in return." Marcus looked at her then, really looked at her, and Genevieve felt a strange, dizzying pull in her chest. It wasn't the polite interest of a suitor, it was the recognition of two souls who had both survived their own versions of a war. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted. The children, sensing the change in their mistress, began to gravitate toward the grim captain. Marcus, perhaps moved by Genevieve's compassion, began to include them in his vigil. He didn't teach them to fight, not exactly. He taught them to see. He sat with the older boys in the attic, pointing out how to identify a man following too closely, how to use the reflections in shop windows, and how to signal danger without speaking a word. "Information is your primary weapon," Marcus told Jack and Pip one afternoon, his voice stern but lacking its previous bite. "If you know where your enemy is before he knows you've spotted him, you've already won half the engagement." Genevieve watched from the doorway as he showed Pip how to properly grease a door hinge to ensure a silent exit. The captain was a natural leader, his patience surprising her. He didn't treat the orphans like charity cases. He treated them like recruits whose lives depended on their competence. He was giving them more than safety. He was giving them agency. The sight stirred something forbidden in Genevieve. She had spent years mourning the husband she had never truly loved, a man of cold duty and even colder beds. But Marcus was fire and steel, hidden beneath a veneer of disciplined restraint. The invitation arrived on Friday, a cream-colored card embossed with gold, a charity gala for the relief of distressed widows, hosted by Lady Danbury. "Sterling will be there," Marcus said, tapping the card against his palm. "It is the perfect venue for him to corner you. He thinks you are hiding. If you appear in public under my protection, it signals that you are not a victim waiting to be silenced, but a threat with an ally." The night of the gala, the air in Genevieve's bedchamber was thick with the scent of rosewater and the nervous energy of preparation. Her corset was tightened to a degree that made every breath a conscious effort, a suffocating reminder of the society she was about to enter. When she descended the stairs in a gown of deep sapphire silk, Marcus was waiting at the foot. He wore a formal black coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his hair brushed back to reveal the silver at his temples. For a moment he simply stared, his gaze traveling from the curve of her throat to the determined set of her jaw. "You look formidable, Mrs. Archer," he said softly. "I feel like a lamb going to the slaughter, Captain." "Then it is a good thing," he said, stepping close enough that she could smell the sandalwood and clean linen that clung to him, that the lamb brought a wolf. The gala was a glittering sea of silk and hypocrisy. Genevieve moved through the crowd on Marcus's arm, her spine a column of ice. And then, across the ballroom, she saw him. Viscount Sterling stood near the punch bowl, laughing at a jest. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Genevieve's. The smile didn't falter, but it changed. It became the predatory grin of a man who had found his lost property. He raised his glass in a silent, mocking toast. Genevieve's hand jerked on Marcus's arm. Her breath hitched, the corset suddenly feeling like iron bands crushing her lungs. "He's looking at me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Marcus, he's smiling." Marcus didn't look at Sterling. He kept his eyes forward, his hand covering hers, his thumb tracing a soothing circle over her knuckles. "Steady, Genevieve," he murmured, using her name for the first time. The sound of it sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Look at me, only at me." He leaned in close, as if sharing a lover's secret, his breath warm against her ear. "We are going to walk toward the terrace, slowly. We are not fleeing, we are merely seeking the air. Trust me." As they moved, Marcus navigated the crowd with a predator's grace, his body a physical barrier between her and the Viscount's gaze. When they reached the shadows of the stone terrace, the cool night air hit her face like a benediction. He didn't let go of her. In the darkness, away from the prying eyes of the ton, he turned her to face him. His hands came up to rest on her waist, pulling her into the private sanctuary of his space. "You did well," he whispered. The adrenaline, the fear, and the sudden, overwhelming proximity to him acted like a physical weight. Genevieve looked up at him, her lips parted. The marriage was a lie, the names were false, but the heat radiating between them was the most honest thing she had felt in years. "I don't want to be a witness anymore, Marcus," she breathed. "I don't want to be afraid." Marcus's gaze darkened, his hands tightening on her waist. For a second, the distance between them vanished, the tension snapping like a bowstring, until a low, rhythmic whistling from the gardens below broke the moment. It was Jack's signal. The fancy cove wasn't just watching them at the ball, he had followed them. The morning after the gala did not bring the clarity of dawn, but rather a suffocating, sulphurous fog that swallowed the streets of Spitalfields whole. Inside the school, the air was thick with a different kind of heaviness. The shared moment on the terrace, the heat of Marcus's hands, the unspoken promise in his dark eyes hung between them, unacknowledged but transformative. Chapter 3. The Trap Sprung. It was the silence that first alerted Genevieve. At 8 o'clock, the breakfast room should have been a cacophony of clattering spoons and high-pitched squabbles. Instead, there was only the rhythmic ticking of the long case clock and the distant, muffled cry of a mudlark down by the river. "Where is Pip?" she asked, her voice tight with a sudden, icy premonition. Jack, usually the most boisterous of the lot, stood by the window, his face pale beneath the usual smudges of soot. He handed her a piece of vellum, too expensive for these slums, its edges crisp and smelling faintly of bergamot. "A trade, Mrs. Archer," the elegant script read. "The boy for the witness. The warehouse at Jacob's Island. Come alone, or the child pays the price for your silence." "He took him from the garden," Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't see, Ma'am. I was checking the back gate like the captain taught me, but they must have come over the wall." Genevieve didn't wait. She didn't seek out Marcus in the study, where he was likely poring over maps of the district.
She knew his mind. He would see this as a tactical problem to be solved with patience and reinforcements. He would tell her to stay, to be the objective he had to protect, but she had seen Sterling's eyes. He didn't want a trade, he wanted a massacre. She grabbed her heavy cloak, concealing a small, sharp kitchen knife in the folds of her skirt, a pathetic defense against a Viscount's steel, but all she had. She slipped out the servants' entrance, disappearing into the grey maw of the London fog. Jacob's Island was a festering sore on the bank of the Thames, a labyrinth of rotting timber, stagnant ditches and warehouses that leaned against one another like drunken giants. The air here was a physical weight, smelling of salt, sewage and decay. Genevieve pushed open the heavy, rusted door of the designated warehouse. Inside, the space was cavernous, lit only by a few sputtering lanterns that cast long, distorted shadows across the mountains of discarded crates. "Ah, the brave widow Archer," a voice drawled from the upper gallery. Viscount Sterling stepped into the light. He looked impeccably dressed for a man about to commit a murder, his charcoal coat tailored to perfection. Below him, tied to a heavy iron pillar, was Pip. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, a dirty rag stuffed into his mouth. "Let him go," Genevieve said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I am here. You have no quarrel with a child." "A child is a loose end, Genevieve, and you are a nuisance." Sterling descended the wooden stairs, his silver-headed cane clicking rhythmically, the same sound she had heard in the alleyway. "Did you truly think a broken soldier could save you? Captain Reed is a man of the past. I am the future of this city." He reached the floor, drawing a slim, lethal blade from the hilt of his cane. The steel gleamed with a cold blue light. "He will find your body in the mud, and he will realize that some men are simply above the law." Genevieve backed away, her mind racing. She wasn't a soldier, but she knew this warehouse. She had come here months ago to haggle for discounted grain for the school. She knew the floorboards were rotted near the cargo lift. "You speak of law," she said, her voice echoing to mask the sound of her hand reaching for a heavy iron pulley hanging from a nearby rope. "But you are nothing but a coward who strikes from the shadows." Sterling lunged. He was fast, but his arrogance made him careless. Genevieve dived behind a stack of crates, the silk of her skirts tearing with a violent screech. "I shall enjoy silencing that tongue," Sterling hissed. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the rafters above. "I wouldn't count on that, Sterling." Marcus dropped from the heights with the silent lethality of a bird of prey. He landed between Genevieve and the Viscount, his cane discarded, a heavy military saber in his hand. He moved with a terrifying, focused grace. The limp that usually slowed him seemingly vanished in the heat of the hunt. "You followed me," Genevieve gasped, her heart surging with a mixture of fury and profound relief. "I taught the boys to track, Genevieve," Marcus said without looking back, his eyes fixed on Sterling. "Did you think they wouldn't track you?" The clash of steel on steel rang out, a sharp, biting sound that filled the empty warehouse. Sterling was a fencer of the schools, all elegance and poise. Marcus was a butcher of the peninsula, all efficiency and power. Every strike from Marcus's saber sent a shudder through Sterling's frame. But Sterling was desperate. He whistled shrilly, and two hired ruffians emerged from the shadows behind Pip. "The boy!" Genevieve cried. She didn't wait for Marcus. She grabbed a heavy glass lantern from a hook and hurled it at the nearest ruffian. It shattered at his feet, spraying oil and flame across the dry floorboards. As the man screamed, Genevieve scrambled toward Pip, her fingers fumbling with the rough twine binding him. "Jack, now!" Marcus roared. From the high, broken windows, a hail of stones and heavy iron bolts descended. The street rats, Jack and the older boys, had scaled the roof. They weren't soldiers, but they were London's own, and they fought with the savage loyalty of family. One ruffian was caught in the eye by a well-aimed sling stone. The other hesitated, terrified by the ghostly shadows attacking from above. In that moment of distraction, Marcus delivered a brutal, crushing blow with the hilt of his sword to Sterling's temple. The Viscount crumpled into the dirt, his fine coat staining with the filth of the floor. Marcus didn't kill him. He stood over him, chest heaving, the tip of his saber resting just beneath Sterling's chin. "For the man in the alley," Marcus rasped, his voice a low growl of righteous fury. "And for the peace you tried to steal from my wife." Genevieve, having finally freed Pip, pulled the trembling boy into her arms. She looked up at Marcus, suited, bloodied, and magnificent. He looked back at her, and in that wreckage of a warehouse, amidst the smoke and the fading screams, the pretense of their arrangement finally burned away.
"Is it over?" she whispered. Marcus sheathed his blade, his hand trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to recede. He walked over to them, sinking to one knee to pull both Genevieve and the boy into a crushing embrace. "It is over," he murmured into her hair. "The law will have him now, and I will have you." The aftermath of violence is never a sudden peace. It is a slow, rhythmic subsiding of the tide, leaving behind the salt crust of memories and the wreckage of what used to be. For 3 days, the St. Jude's Home for Foundlings existed in a state of soft-footed transition. The scorch marks in the warehouse were a world away, and Viscount Sterling was safely ensconced in Newgate, awaiting a trial that would strip him of everything but his shame. Chapter 4. The Peace After the Storm. The morning of the 4th day brought a different kind of visitor. Mr. Holloway, a man of such extreme bureaucratic dryness that he seemed composed entirely of parchment and ink, sat in Genevieve's parlour. He sipped his tea with a precision that made Genevieve want to scream. "The Home Office is most satisfied, Mrs. Archer," Holloway said, setting his cup down with a delicate clink. "The threat is neutralized. The testimony you provided, along with the rather unorthodox assistance of Captain Reed, has secured the Crown's interests. As such, the charade may now conclude." Genevieve felt a cold hollow open beneath her ribs. "Conclude?" "Indeed, the Captain's commission as your cousin is terminated. His belongings will be moved to his club this afternoon, and the official record will state that Mr. Marcus Archer has returned to the Indies." Holloway stood, adjusting his spectacles. "You are, once again, a widow of independent means. You have your life back." My life, Genevieve thought, looking around the room. It was the life she had fought for, quiet, autonomous, safe. So why did the prospect of it feel like a sentence of solitary confinement? Marcus entered the room as Holloway departed. He was dressed for travel, his heavy greatcoat draped over his arm. The rugged, vital man who had fought like a demon in the warehouse now looked like a soldier awaiting a new set of orders. "The carriage is at the corner," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but he didn't look at her. He was obsessively smoothing the leather of his gloves. "So quickly?" Genevieve asked. Her throat felt tight, constricted by a grief she hadn't given herself permission to feel. "Duty is a demanding master, Genevieve. The arrangement was for your protection. You are safe now. My presence here, it is no longer required." He turned to go, his cane tapping a funeral march against the floorboards. But as he reached the threshold, the hallway was suddenly blocked. It wasn't a barricade of furniture, but of small, determined bodies.
Jack stood in the center, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a mimicry of Marcus's own stubborn expression. Behind him, Pip and the other 19 orphans stood in a silent, unwavering line. "You can't go," Jack said, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I must, Jack," Marcus replied, his voice softening. "The war is over." "It isn't," Pip cried, stepping forward and grabbing a handful of Marcus's coat. "Who's going to teach us how to signal the watch? Who's going to check the locks? You said we were a unit. You said a unit stays together."
Genevieve watched, the breath catching in her lungs. Marcus looked down at the boy, and for the first time the mask of the hardened veteran shattered. His hand came up to rest on Pip's head, his fingers trembling. He looked like a man who had spent his life wandering through a desert and had finally stumbled upon a well. He looked back at Genevieve. The silence between them stretched, thick with the scent of the rain-dampened garden and the unspoken truths of the last month. "They are right," Genevieve said, her voice barely a whisper. She stepped toward him, crossing the distance that propriety and fear had built. "The captain is no longer required, but perhaps the man is." Marcus dropped his coat. He took a step toward her, his limp forgotten, his eyes searching hers with a raw, desperate hope. "Genevieve, I have nothing to offer but a name that is half forgotten and a heart that is far from whole. I have spent my life with whole men who were hollow inside," she replied, reaching out to cup his scarred cheek. "I would rather have your fragments than any other man's entirety." Marcus let out a long, shuddering breath. He went to one knee, not with the practiced grace of a courtier, but with the heavy, grounded sincerity of a man surrendering his sword. "Then let us make a new arrangement," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "No lies, no duty to the crown, only a promise. I will spend the rest of my days building a fortress around this family, if you will have me." "I will have you," she whispered, pulling him up to meet her. The wedding took place a fortnight later in the small chapel of St. Jude's. There were no viscounts in attendance, no gold-embossed invitations, and no suffocating corsets.
Genevieve walked down the aisle in a dress of simple cream lace, her hand tucked into the crook of Marcus's arm. He walked with a slight hitch in his stride, his head held high, looking not like a man who had lost his way, but one who had finally come home. The pews were overflowing with 20 children, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes bright with the knowledge that they were no longer merely foundlings. They were the witnesses to a different kind of truth, that love, much like a well-tended garden, can grow even in the most scarred and soot-stained earth. As the curate pronounced them man and wife, Marcus leaned down, his lips brushing Genevieve's ear in a ghost of that night on the terrace. "You are no longer a widow, my love," he whispered. "And you," she replied, looking at the family they had built together, "are no longer alone." In the quiet of the London night, as the bells of St. Paul's chimed in the distance, the captain and his lady stood by the window of their shared home. The war was a memory, the shadows were merely shadows, and for the first time in a lifetime of service and sorrow, Marcus Reed finally understood that the greatest victory was not in the conquering of an enemy, but in the surrender to a heart that finally knew where it belonged.